sometimes when we do wrongs, we judge ourselves, right? I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong of me. I shouldn't have done that. And in our judging ourselves, we can either condemn ourselves or we can fall to the opposite extreme of trying to justify ourselves even when we're truly wrong, right? Welcome to the Architecting Through Life podcast, where we dig into principles for building ourselves up as individuals while navigating the realities of this thing called life. The podcast is dedicated to young adults and anyone with the deep hunger to grow in their journey of being all that they were created to be. My name is Simon Gubeni, and with each episode I'll be discussing thoughts and insights drawn from life, from the Bible, from unique experiences, as well as from other great minds and mentors. Thanks for joining me on this journey, and I do hope that you'll enjoy today's episode. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. If it is your first time, welcome. If it's not your first time, appreciate you finding enough value to check back in again. Today's episode, I want to get into something I'll entitle Judging Yourself and Judging Others. Oftentimes as we exist in this world, we often face encounters with different people, with different relationships, different experiences. And all of us at some point in our lives have different kinds of relationships, right? We have professional relationships, we've got romantic relationships, we've got familial relationships, all of which have varying degrees of intimacy, right? Whether it's just casual greetings or down to being able to share deep thoughts and feelings and fears, etc., etc. But in all of those, it's all on account of facing different experiences with different people, of different backgrounds, different perspectives, different temperaments and different ways of seeing things, right? Because all people are, in essence, different in the sense of our different experiences and ways of seeing things, right? All of us are people, but because of different backgrounds, temperaments, experiences, we see things differently, right? And so as you can imagine, there's bound to be differences when people interact at one point or another, right? Whether it's differences in how you think something should be done, differences in how you see things. Differences are bound to happen, right? And on account of that, you can imagine that differences will then bring conflict, right? Especially when one or both or more parties want to have their way at the expense of another, right? And that's often how conflict arises, when there's a difference in opinion or difference in how people think things should be done, and one wants to have their way at the expense of or above another's, right? And so differences are bound to arise, and when conflicts and differences do arise, it's easy to, so to say, judge other people's conclusions or motives for doing things, right? To judge their motives based on the things that you and I might not be happy about in that scenario, in that situation, right? And that's what I want to give a thought to, right? A thought which came to mind after a discussion I was having with someone about how differences in interactions with different people lead to those differences in encounters and experiences, which lead to conflict, and which then sometimes, depending on how you experience that conflict, leads to then the act of judging, right? The act of making conclusions and judging other people's motives, why other people did things, and basically the source of the conflict, right? And obviously, as you can imagine, that act of judging doesn't necessarily work towards contributing to solving whatever that conflict may be, right? And that's what I want to look at. And to do that, I want to give a thought to a text in Matthew chapter 7, right? Matthew chapter 7, where a text which I'm sure many people know, at least the first few words. Matthew chapter 7, the first and second verse, that says there, "Do not judge others, and you will not be judged. For you will be treated as you treat others, and the standard that you use in judging is the standard by which you also will be judged." Right? That's Matthew chapter 7, the first and second verse. And the idea there is that don't judge, because of the same measure with which you judge others, you also will be judged, right? And so that's Christ speaking to a multitude of people, speaking to a large audience, and giving what's called the Sermon on the Mount, teaching them different principles and different themes which relate to this idea of the kingdom of God, right? And the point that he makes in that chapter is that don't judge, for with the same judgment that you use to judge others, you also will be judged, right? And that text is actually quite interesting when you sit down to think about it, right? So he's saying don't judge, And the reason he says don't judge isn't because there's necessarily something wrong with judging, but he says the standard that you use to judge others is a standard to which you yourself would not want to be judged by, right? So his issue is not that there's a problem with judgment, but that his issue is that the judgment is at a standard. We tend to judge others at a standard with which we ourselves would not want to be judged by, right? And so that's Christ's point. It's not that there's anything wrong with judging in and of itself, because in different scenarios we do need to judge, and I'll get into why I say that. But his point is that human judgment is at times unmerciful because we judge others by the standard with which we ourselves would not want to be judged by. And that's often the case, right? We expect perfection of others at a standard which we ourselves would not be able to meet if we were to be put to the test on it, right? We want everyone to be able to be perfect in their dealings with us without flaws, knowing full well that we all as individuals have flaws, right? Have errors, right? And so what you note there is that the problem with judgment isn't that judgment would not be accurate, but that the judgment would be unmerciful, right? Unjust. And when I talk about judging, I'm basically talking about like what a judge does, right? A judge passes sentence on a case, like in a court of law. When the judge offers his judgment, he's passing a sentence on someone. He's saying that, okay, you have committed such and such an act, and so you are deserving of such and such a retribution, right? You are deserving of such and such a penalty, so to say, right? It's to make an ultimate conclusion on something or someone. And so that's sort of referring to when you talk about this idea of judging, right? It's to pass a judgment and say, okay, you have committed such and such an act, and you are deserving of such and such a retribution, right? And Christ's words, or Jesus' words, aren't to say that the problem with human judgment isn't that it's inaccurate, but that the problem with human judgment is that it is unmerciful, right? So oftentimes when people judge others, we want people to get exactly what they deserve, right? That people must get exactly what they deserve, without often recognizing that if we were to be judged by the standard with which we judge others, we would not be able to stand, right? And so Christ's words to reiterate is the idea that don't judge others, because you also will be judged, and you'll be treated as you treat others. And the standard that you use in judging others is the standard with which you also will be judged. And so the unmerciful standard with which you judge others, or with which I judge others, is a standard with which I will be judged as well. And so that's Christ's encouragement. In fact, there's another text that says, that for, I think it's James chapter 2, James chapter 2, verse 13, that says, judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown no mercy, and mercy triumphs over judgment, right? And the idea behind that is such a profound text. It says there that the one who judges without mercy, right? So as we go about life, we judge different people, we judge different experiences, and it says the one who judges without mercy will be judged without mercy, right? And so if I, in my judging others, like, no, you deserve exactly what you have done for your wrong, without any mercy, must be mindful, because that's the standard with which I myself will be judged when I make mistakes on my path, And I see this a lot with cancel culture, right? With cancel culture, with cancel culture, where the missteps of individuals, despite how far back they may have been, right, 10 years ago, when something unearths in a person's reputation, cancel culture is like, no, I'm going to cancel you, I'm going to judge you, you're deserving of, expulsion from society and whatnot. But when one who is prone to canceling others is found in a scenario where they themselves are flawed in some way, it's always interesting to see how cancel culture always goes back around, that it's unmerciful. And that's the point with unmerciful judgment, that you receive judgment without mercy when you yourself show no mercy, right? But that's an aside. The point in the text is there that when we go about judging, it's important to be merciful because we ourselves want mercy, right? Mercy is when justice is tempered with a sense of mercy and consideration of the fact that there were certain factors that led to whatever that mistake or misdemeanor was, right? It's willingness to give someone the benefit of the doubt, so to say. And then the text closes off by saying that mercy triumphs over judgment, right? Mercy triumphs over judgment. And this is the idea. Mercy has the power to do something that judgment is not able to do. So if you think about a conflict, let's say, that arises, someone does something wrong, they acknowledge they're wrong, or even if you put yourself in that situation, you do something wrong, you made a mistake, and you are deserving of, let's say, justice, right? You've made a mistake in an encounter, you made a mistake in a relationship, you made a mistake in a promise that you made and you could not keep or did not keep. You are aware of the fact that you are deserving of punitive measures, whatever they may be, right? But mercy has a way of doing what judgment can't, in that while judgment may be passed, it makes you be aware of your wrong. Mercy has a way of, when it is exercised, not only granting people pardon, but also restoring relationships, right? And that's what judgment is unable to do. That mercy reaches where judgment can't, and that mercy is able to restore relationships when disagreements happen, right? So one may be deserving of being cut off or of being cancelled or whatnot, but mercy has a way of restoring relationships, right? And I think about that when I think about, as a scenario, when democratic change happens in a country, and those who may have been beneficiaries of unjust systems, so to say, like apartheid in South Africa, who may in some instances be, what I could say, earned certain judgments, we tend to praise the likes of Mandelas and the likes of Bikos and the likes of other struggle fighters who, in their right to exercise judgment, extend a hand of mercy to those who were even wronged, right? And that's the principle, that mercy triumphs over judgment, right? Now, one may say, depending on whatever camp you're in, that no, that was not right, or that was premature, or whatever. But that's not where I am. Where I am is the fact that the world seems to find virtue in the exercise of mercy when complete justice is deserved, right? When complete justice is deserved. It's a whole discussion, on whether the balance between justice and mercy. But where I am now is that you receive judgment without mercy when you show no mercy. But there's a thought I want to give in view of all of this, and going back to the title of judging yourself and judging others, to say, if the problem is not judgment, but the problem is the standard with which we judge, how are we to judge, right? At least that's the thought that comes to mind. That says, okay, how are we to judge people in order for us to not find ourselves in situations where we're constantly being hoodwinked, where we're constantly being on the back foot, where we're constantly being abused, or where we're constantly being taken advantage of? How can we exercise discernment and judgment so as to still be merciful, but to not find ourselves in situations where we are taken advantage of, right? And I want to think of it in two ways. That Jesus says, judge others by the standard with which you would want to be judged as well, right? And I would rephrase that, or maybe add an annexure to it in my interpretation of that idea. And in my conversation with this person I was having an interaction with, what's the point of saying, okay, it seems best to judge others by their actions, but to judge yourself by your motives, right? And why do I include that idea of judging yourself? Sometimes when we do wrongs, we judge ourselves, right? I shouldn't have done that. That was wrong of me. I shouldn't have done that. And in our judging ourselves, we can either condemn ourselves, or we can fall to the opposite extreme of trying to justify ourselves even when we are truly wrong, right? And so when we judge others, we can be unjust, but when we judge ourselves, we can also be unjust in either condemning ourselves more than is necessary, or giving ourselves too much leeway when we really were at wrong, when we really were at fault, right? And obviously that never works towards solving a conflict or solving a situation in a conflict. But the idea is, judge yourself by your motives and judge others by their actions, right? Now what does that mean? I'll start with judging others by their actions, or maybe before we go there, there's a necessary distinction between your motives and your actions, right? Distinction in the sense that your motives are the seeds and your actions are the fruits, right? So you have a good motive and you try to translate that good motive into actions, right? But sometimes it's not always the case that your good actions or your good motives are successfully translated into actions, right? So a scenario, you make a promise to someone that, okay, look, I will come and pick you up at 8 o'clock. I will be there on time. I promise I'll be there at 8 so that I can drop you off at your appointment at a specific time. That's a good motive, right? A motive of being punctual and fulfilling a promise. Let's say in your drive towards picking that person up, there's a roadblock on the way, there's traffic, you're supposed to divert now and take a different route, and you arrive an hour late. your good motive did not succeed in translating into good actions because of a certain circumstance or a scenario that occurred. Now, the person you're picking up might then say, no, it's because you were lazy, or it's because you took your time, or it's because you didn't want me to arrive on time. They're judging you by your motives. And it's easy for a person in that situation to say no, but to condemn themselves because of feeling as though I did something so wrong because I didn't fulfill the promise I'd made. But you know what your motives are, and so you risk facing unnecessary or illegitimate guilt because of overly judging yourself by your actions, which were different from what your true motives were, right? A very general or generic example, but the principle is judge yourself by your motives, judge others by their actions, right? And so if you were, for example, the person who was being picked up at the time, you will never be able to know a person's motives, right? The depths of the human heart are far too deep for any human eye to discern, right? Especially another person's heart. Like, we can never truly know a person's deepest motives beyond what we see on the surface. And so that's why it's then merciful to judge by the actions that are right in front of us. Because sometimes the motives aren't always as obvious as the actions, right? And by actions, I mean, for example, going back to the illustration of being picked up. If the last time you were picked up on time and the last time before that you were picked up on time, this one time suggests inconsistency in the actions, but you know that the past occurrences of being picked up were attuned to good motives, and so you are able to look at the evidence of the actions and say, no, maybe there was something that prevented this person from fulfilling their promise, right? But the idea is to judge myself by my motives and judge others by their actions, right? So the idea is that we can never truly know people's motives, right? We can never truly know people's motives. We can speculate, we can guess, we can assume and imagine the motives, but all we have as the most tangible results are people's actions, right? And that's the best at which we can judge people by, right? Their actions. And this idea of being merciful is to judge knowing that when we make assumptions on motives, oftentimes the assumption that we make is the worst one, right? It's the worst possible motive that could be the case is the first one that we tend to believe to be the actual motive. But mercy is to realize that I can't know your motives, and so I will judge by your actions, trusting that what you express as your true motives are really what you say they are, right? And then judging yourself by your motives is to try and be also merciful to ourselves, right? To be merciful to ourselves that when I've committed a wrong, when I've made a mistake, to not wallow in regret and in shame and guilt and whatnot, because I knew that, okay, my motives were good, but perhaps at a time when you committed wrong, you didn't know better. Or perhaps at a time when you made a mistake, there were situations and circumstances which hindered you from fulfilling what your good motives were. But also, judging yourself by your motives includes being honest about when my motives weren't really good, right? Like if I did something because I truly was, out of anger or out of trying to hurt another person or out of trying to want to harm or cause harm, then judging myself by my motives is an opportunity for me to then look back and try to mend where that wrong motive is. Because sometimes we can try to do good actions knowing full well that we've got bad motives, right? There's this thing that's called malicious obedience. Malicious obedience is when you do something that someone asks you to do knowing full well that that thing is going to harm them, right? But you do it either way because part of you wants to actually harm them, right? So it's an obedience that is malicious, right? But yeah, without going into too many scattered ideas, the idea is to think about that point of judging myself by my motives, but judging others by their actions, right? That if I'm going to be merciful both to myself and to others, to judge ourselves by our motives and to judge others by their actions, granting them the benefit of the doubt and knowing that we don't know what the true motives were. And so we give space to, I guess, interpreting the actions based on the actions themselves, right? And not guessing at what the ill or positive motive was, right? So that you've made a mistake, to not assume that, okay, that mistake was made because you truly are malicious and malevolent and you're trying to really cause harm, but to give the benefit of the doubt that all I have at my disposal is this person's actions, and I can only judge based on that, right? One of my favorite quotes is from a man named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. text or passage or quote which encourages me a lot. It says, "If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life enough sorrow and suffering to disarm all hostility." Right? If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should see in each man's life enough sorrow and suffering to disarm all hostility. Going back to the point of conflict earlier, oftentimes we aren't able to interpret or discern people's motives or even the underlying experiences that cause them, right? The fact of their sorrow and suffering, the fact of their childhood trauma, the fact of their childhood experiences, the fact of the triggers that cause their actions. And what the quote is saying, that if we could see the secret sufferings and sorrows that have plagued the lives of our enemies and even our friends, we should see in each man's life enough sorrow and suffering to disarm all hostility, to realize that this person isn't a villain, but there's certain sorrows and sufferings which they've gone through, which are contributing to the actions that they've committed, which I may or may not like. That's a thought I just wanted to share. I'm interested to hear your thoughts, if you'd agree, if you disagree. But otherwise, my name is Simon, and I'm wishing you all the best on your journey of architecting through life. Much love. Thank you for listening to the episode that you've just heard on the Architecting Through Life podcast. If you found it valuable, please kindly do me the favor of sharing it and maybe leaving a comment if you'd like. I'd really like to get your thoughts, any impact that you might feel it may have, and do feel free to share it with someone else so that it can be a benefit to them as well. Thank you so much for your time, and do join us again on the next episode of the Architecting Through Life podcast.